Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his book, A Theory of Justice, John Rawls will identify two principles of justice that he takes to be at the core of the theory which he is offering as the correct one and as a guide not just for social and political theory, but also in some other respects for ethics, more broadly speaking. And he sets things up in such a way that we're going to arrive at these principles by engaging in a sort of thought experiment or hypothetical situation. The original position or initial situation, he calls it, and it's associated with this term, the veil of ignorance. And the basic idea is that we're deciding on fundamental principles that are going to govern the way society works, and we're going to come to some sort of agreement together on them deliberatively, rationally, without knowing where we would end up in that society, without knowing who we are going to be. And Rawls thinks that if we enter into those sort of conditions, if we carry out this reasoning process in that way, we're going to arrive inevitably at two really fundamental basic principles, which then he articulates. One is, as he's going to call it early on, equality in assignment of basic rights and duties, and he'll flesh that out a little bit more. And then the second is that inequalities are only just if they result in compensating benefits for all, not for the aggregate of society. So he's avoiding any sort of utilitarianism here. As a matter of fact, he explicitly rejects utilitarianism. He's saying that inequalities, if they're going to be just, if they're going to be right, if they're going to be acceptable, have to provide benefits for everybody in that society. So a little bit later in the work, in chapter 11, he titles that Two Principles of Justice. And he says, I'm going to state in a provisional form these two principles that I believe would be agreed to in the original position. And he tells us that the formulation of these is tentative, so he's going to refine them a little bit more in the course of the book. But these are, in fact, the articulations that most people who are working off of Rawls take to be essentially the way to understand these. So he says, here's the way we can state these two principles. The first, he says, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. So that requires a little bit of unpacking, but it's a fairly succinct formulation. The second, he says, and this one has two different parts to it, the second is that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both, here's the two conditions, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage and to be attached to positions and offices open to all. So let's look at these initially, and then we'll look at what Rawls actually has to say. First, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. So obviously that last part, you can't have freedom to anything whatsoever, like freedom to imprison your neighbor in the cellar for 20 years, feeding them on apples and root vegetables or something like that. That's ridiculous, right? Because you're violating their freedom in that case. And this is where we get into, once we get away from the general principles and we get into the nitty-gritty, it gets quite complex, right? I want to exercise my freedom to listen to my music at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I live on a 10-acre plot. My neighbors are kind of far away. How loud can I have it cranked up? We get into these sort of questions. Rawls isn't concerned at this point in worrying about that, but he knows that those situations are going to arise sooner or later. Now, an equal right, so not, one person gets more than others, to the most extensive scheme, the widest possible scheme of equal basic liberties. And we can also call these equal rights. So this is going to be pretty expansive. And you might say, well, man, he sounds like a libertarian. As we see, he's actually going to be opposed to that sort of view, and it's going to lead more towards an egalitarianism of sorts. Let's look at the second one now. So like we pointed out, it's got two different parts to it. And it says that there can be social and economic inequalities. So, it seems like there's going to be some tension here with the first, but we're going to see how these are reconciled. Social and economic inequalities can exist, but they have to be of such a nature so that they're meeting these two conditions. Now, that would mean society would have to have some basic rules governing these things. You can't just, let inequalities grow and do whatever they're going to do. Social Darwinism. Rawls would reject that sort of view, right? He would say, no, we can have inequalities. You can pay doctors more than, street sweepers, but you got to have some reasons for it. So one of the reasons is it's reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage. Now notice, he doesn't say, we know with 100% certainty. No, reasonably expected. Reasonable people can get together and say, if we don't pay doctors better, there may be a few people who do it as a hobby or because they're, drawn to that profession, but we're probably going to have a crisis with medicine, so it would be to everybody's advantage to actually have doctors be compensated more highly. Maybe not, astronomically highly, then we start getting into the specifics, right? Now notice the other part, and attached to positions and offices open to all. There has to be equal access, equal opportunity if we're going to have inequalities. They have to be attached to things that really anybody within the society, if they choose to, say, undergo the training or the licensing or whatever it's going to be, that they could have access to it. They aren't just simply being excluded. So let's now look at how Rawls goes a little bit into detail about this. In talking about the first principle, he says that the basic liberties can be given by a list of these sorts of liberties. These include political liberty, the right to vote and hold public office, freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience, that is to say no to things or to do things because you have formulated, that it's the right thing to do. Freedom of thought, freedom of the person, he says, which includes freedom from psychological oppression, or maybe say bullying or harassment, and physical assault and dismemberment. The right to hold personal property and freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure. He says all of these liberties are to be equal by the first principle. If you give them to one person, you got to give them to everybody, and you've got to observe them equally. So you can't, for example, say, stop and frisk, it really is okay to do to people who are poor, or people who have dark skin, or people who look like they might be coming from the Middle East, or, right? All these sort of provisos. If you're going to do stop and frisk, you got to apply it to everybody equally, because you're infringing on some basic liberties, freedom of arbitrary arrest and seizure, perhaps freedom of thought, depending on what they're expressing, with what they're wearing. There's all sorts of things here. Probably a stop and frisk policy is not going to pass Rawlsian rules. But there's all sorts of other things that we could think about. So, holding personal property, right? Should this be allowed? Yes. Rawls says, of course. Doesn't mean that I can do anything whatsoever I want with my property, because that could infringe on the liberties of others. What about the second one? He says, the second principle applies to the distribution of income and wealth and to the design of organizations that make use of differences in authority and responsibility. So now we're getting to things that are quite important. He says, while the distribution of wealth and income need not be equal, it must be to everybody's advantage. That's a very telling point. If you want to have a just society, you can certainly have inequalities, but those inequalities must work out to the advantage of everybody. It's hard to see how in contemporary modern society, the massive inequalities that we have actually work out well for, say, the homeless population, or the working poor, or even, the middle class, whatever that happens to be. They seem to work out quite well for others, and they would fail on Rawls's account in that case. You could say, well, we need to encourage job creation and innovation and bringing products to market and all that. Okay. If it's really to the advantage of everybody, not just shareholders, not just those who like getting the newest thing, but to everybody, if you can make a case for that, then you can have those inequalities. But those still have to be open to anybody, say, then, in that case, entering the market, right? Positions, he says, of authority and responsibility must be accessible to all. One applies the second principle by holding positions open, and then, subject to this constraint, arranges social and economic inequality so that everybody benefits. Now notice, he doesn't just say economic inequalities, he's also saying social inequalities. How we treat people, how we regard people. This is very important. We want to be able to acknowledge the dignity of other human beings. Now, he's going to go on and say that there's a priority between these two. The first takes priority over the second. And again, when you hear that, you might say, yeah, he sounds like a libertarian. In fact, again, it's not that case. As he goes on, he says that infringements of the basic equal liberties protected by the first principle cannot be justified or compensated for by the greater social and economic advantages. These liberties have a central range of application in which they can be limited and compromised only when they conflict with other basic liberties. So he says, for example, liberties not on the list, the right to own certain kinds of property, for example, means of production, and freedom of contract as understood by the doctrine of laissez-faire, these are not basic and are not protected by the priority of the first principle. So he also says, with regard to the second principle, the distribution of wealth and income and positions of authority and responsibility must be consistent with both the basic liberties and equality of opportunity. And then he provides us with a sort of summary of how you can bring these two together. He says, all social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the social bases of self-respect are to be distributed equally unless an unequal distribution of any or all of these values is to everyone's advantage. So again, we see that he's willing to countenance some inequality, but you've got to be able to make a case that it is reasonably expected to be to the advantage of all. Not a merely rhetorical case about, job creation, or it's better to be paternalistic and not have people, thinking for themselves, or whatever you're going to do, you actually have to be able to make a strong case that the inequalities are going to be to everybody's advantage. And so these two principles provide the skeleton of Rawls's egalitarian conception of justice. This is applicable to any organization, to any institution, to any interaction between people, provided we're thinking things through. And it's definitely intended to provide overarching rules or a conception of justice for an entire society. Now, most societies would fail these rules, which means that most societies are, at least to some degree, unjust. And this would be helpful in telling us how and why and to what extent they're unjust. And conversely, if we're following Rawls's theory, what we would need to do in order to move that society or organization or whatever it's going to be towards a more just condition. So this is the two principles, again, right at the very center of Rawls's conception of justice, derived by considering what rational people would do within a veil of ignorance in which they have to work out rules for everybody, not knowing where they would end up in that society. It would be rational, Rawls says, to choose these two different principles and to enforce them.